There's a moment that almost everyone knows too well. Someone says something small, a comment, a look, a tone, and suddenly you're no longer in control. Something inside you tightens, your chest feels heavier, your thoughts speed up, your calm disappears. Later, you replay the moment in your head, you think of what you should have said, what you wish you had done, and you wonder why something so minor had so much power over you. Most people assume this is just how emotions work. They believe reactions are automatic, unavoidable, part of being human. But that assumption is exactly where the problem begins. Because if emotions truly controlled you, if reactions were inevitable, then self-control would be a myth. And yet you've seen people who don't react the same way. They don't explode, they don't spiral, they don't lose themselves over words, delays, or disrespect. So the question isn't whether emotional control is possible. The real question is this: why do some people react instantly while others remain steady? Most people never stop to examine this. They move from reaction to reaction, day after day, believing their emotions are caused by the world outside them. But think about this carefully. If events alone caused emotions, then everyone would react the same way to the same situation. They don't. One person feels insulted, another shrugs and moves on. One person feels anxious, another stays calm under the same pressure. That tells us something important. The event itself isn't the true cause. Something else happens before the emotion appears, something internal, quiet, often unnoticed. This is where control is either lost or quietly preserved. Most people never see this moment. They only notice the emotion once it's already taken over. By then they believe it's too late, but it isn't. What you're about to understand isn't about suppressing emotions. It's not about pretending you don't feel anything. And it's not about becoming cold or detached from life. It's about recognizing where reactions are born, because once you understand why you react, you stop blaming yourself for being weak, and you stop blaming the world for being unfair. You begin to see emotions for what they actually are, signals, not commands. And the moment you stop obeying every signal, control quietly returns. Most people skip this step entirely. They jump straight to techniques, quotes, or motivation, and that's why nothing changes. Before control, there must be clarity, and that's exactly what comes next. Once you realize that emotions aren't caused directly by events, a more uncomfortable question appears. If the world isn't controlling your reactions, then what is? This is where most people feel resistance, because the answer challenges something deeply ingrained. You've been taught implicitly or explicitly that emotions happen to you, that anger is triggered, that anxiety appears, that frustration arrives on its own. But the Stoics saw something different. They noticed that between what happens and how you feel, there is a silent step almost no one notices, a judgment, not a dramatic one, not a conscious decision, just a quiet interpretation. Something happens, and instantly the mind labels it unfair, disrespectful, threatening, embarrassing, unacceptable. That label arrives so fast it feels invisible, and the moment it appears, the emotion follows. Anger doesn't rise because someone spoke. It rises because the mind decided this should not have happened. Anxiety doesn't appear because of uncertainty. It appears because the mind decided this outcome would be unbearable. If this feels confronting, it should, because it means the source of control is closer than you were taught to believe. This distinction matters more than it seems, because if emotions were truly automatic, then control would be impossible. But if emotions follow judgments, even unconscious ones, then reactions are not fate, they are learned responses. This idea isn't modern psychology, it's ancient. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Roman emperor wrote privately in his journal that people are disturbed, not by things themselves, but by the views they take of those things. That emperor was Marcus Aurelius. He wasn't writing to teach others, he was writing to discipline his own mind, because even with power, status, and authority, he noticed the same human weakness. you still experience today, the tendency to confuse events with judgments. This is the Stoic diagnosis. The emotion you feel is not the problem. The problem is the meaning your mind assigns before the emotion even forms. And because this process happens automatically, most people never question it. They feel insulted, so they assume they were insulted. They feel anxious, so they assume danger is present. They feel angry, so they assume injustice occurred. But feeling something does not prove the judgment behind it is true. This is where Stoicism becomes practical, not philosophical. The Stoics didn't deny emotion, they denied emotion's authority. They understood that emotions are consequences, not commanders, signals, not orders. When this is misunderstood, people try to fight emotions directly. They suppress anger, they resist anxiety, they distract themselves from discomfort, and the emotion returns stronger, because the judgment that created it was never examined. Imagine a smoke alarm going off. You don't smash the alarm, you look for the smoke. Emotions are the alarm, judgments are the smoke. Most people spend their lives arguing with alarms instead of removing the source. Stoicism teaches you to look deeper, not to criticize yourself, not to force calm, but to notice the exact moment when the mind decides something is bad. That decision is usually fast, automatic, conditioned by habit, ego, and expectation, but it is not unchangeable. The Stoics believed that freedom begins not when emotions disappear, but when awareness appears, because awareness slows the process, and when the process slows, control becomes possible. This doesn't make you emotionless, it makes you precise, and precision is where real calm begins. Once you understand that emotions follow judgments, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why do those judgments appear so quickly? Why does the mind react before you even realize what's happening? The Stoics noticed that reactions don't come from a single source. They come from a pattern, one that repeats quietly day after day. There are three forces working together behind every emotional reaction. Most people experience the emotion, but never see the structure beneath it. The first force is expectation. You expect people to behave a certain way, to be fair, to be respectful, to understand you. When reality violates those expectations, the mind immediately interprets it as a problem. This shouldn't be happening. This isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to go. That single expectation, often unspoken, creates the opening for frustration, anger, or resentment. The world didn't change. Your expectation collided with reality, and when expectation fails, something else tightens. The second force is attachment. You become attached to outcomes, to how you are seen, to how situations should end. When those attachments are threatened, the mind reacts as if something essential is being taken away. Your reputation, your comfort, your sense of control. The stronger the attachment, the stronger the emotional reaction when it's disturbed. This is why small events can trigger intense emotions. It's not the event itself, it's what the event threatens in your mind. And when attachment is strong enough, the reaction becomes personal. The third force is identification. This is the most subtle and the most powerful. You don't just experience situations, you merge with them. Someone disagrees with you, and it feels like you are being attacked. A mistake happens, and it feels like you are the mistake. A delay occurs, and it feels like your time is being disrespected. The mind turns events into personal statements, and once something feels personal, emotion takes over completely. Expectation sets the standard. Attachment gives it weight. Identification makes it feel like survival. When these three align, reaction feels inevitable, even though it isn't. Together, they form the engine of reaction. This is why telling yourself to stay calm rarely works. By the time you notice the emotion, this entire process has already run. Most people live inside this pattern without ever seeing it. They blame the world, they blame other people, they blame their temperament, but none of those are the root. The root is unexamined expectation, attachment, and identification. If this feels uncomfortable to hear, That's not a bad sign. It means you're looking in the right place. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment, not to judge yourself, not to analyze your past, just to reflect. Which of these three pulls you off balance most often? Is it expectation, needing things to go a certain way? Is it attachment, holding tightly to outcomes or approval? Or is it identification, taking everything personally? You don't need to answer out loud, just notice what comes to mind. Awareness always begins with discomfort. Most people rush past this moment. They want solutions immediately. They want techniques. They want relief. But skipping this step is why relief never lasts. Because control doesn't start with action. It starts with perception. When you begin to notice expectations forming, attachments tightening, identification creeping in, something changes. The reaction slows. Not because you forced it to stop, but because you saw it happening. And that pause, even a brief one, creates distance. Distance between the event and the emotion. Distance between the thought and the reaction. Distance between stimulus and response. This distance is small at first, almost fragile, but it's enough. Enough to choose not to react immediately. Enough to question the judgment forming. Enough to remain present instead of impulsive. The Stoics believed this distance was the doorway to freedom. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom from being controlled. You don't eliminate expectation overnight. You don't erase attachment instantly. You don't stop identification in a single moment. But you can notice them, and what you notice you begin to loosen. This is the point where most people think they already understand themselves. But understanding isn't the same as awareness. Awareness is lived in real time. In the exact moment a reaction begins to form, and that awareness is what we need to talk about next, because without it, everything you've heard so far stays theoretical. With it, control becomes practical. Up to this point, everything you've heard explains why reactions happen. But explanation alone doesn't change behavior. What changes behavior is awareness. Not vague awareness, but precise awareness at the exact moment a reaction begins. This is where Stoicism separates itself from motivation and advice. The Stoics understood something subtle. They realized that between a stimulus and an emotional reaction, there is a brief moment of perception. It's short, often overlooked, but it exists. That moment is the difference between being carried away and remaining still. Most people don't notice it because they're trained to move fast. Fast thoughts, fast judgments, fast reactions. The mind labels something as bad, and the body follows immediately. But when awareness is present, that automatic chain weakens, not because you force it, but because you see it. You begin to notice the thought before the emotion fully forms, the expectation tightening, the attachment pulling, the sense of "this is about me" creeping in. And in that moment, something important happens. You stop being inside the reaction and start observing it. This doesn't mean the emotion disappears instantly. It means it no longer has absolute authority. Instead of being inside anger, you notice anger arising. Instead of being consumed by anxiety, you recognize anxious thoughts forming. That shift may seem small, but it's decisive. Because once you see a reaction forming, you are no longer identical to it. You are separate from it. This separation is not suppression. It's not denial. It's not pretending you feel nothing. It's precision. And precision creates calm. This is why people who practice this don't look tense or forced. They don't look like they're holding themselves back. They look steady, because their calm isn't manufactured, it's observed. The mind can only carry you away when you're unaware it's doing so. The moment awareness appears, the reaction loses speed, and when speed is lost, choice appears. You may still feel the emotion, but you are no longer dragged by it. You can pause, you can breathe, you can decide not to act immediately. This is the beginning of discipline, not discipline imposed from outside, but discipline emerging from clarity. If this perspective changes how you see your emotions, then it's doing what it's meant to do. Because the goal here isn't to eliminate feeling, it's to stop being ruled by it. Most people believe calm is something you either have or don't have, a personality trait, a gift. The Stoics saw calm as a skill, and like any skill, it begins with awareness. Not tomorrow, not after reading more, but in the exact moment your mind decides something is a threat. That's where practice begins. And once awareness is present, something else becomes obvious. Not everything that happens deserves your attention. Not everything that triggers a feeling deserves a response, which leads naturally to the next distinction. Because once you see how reactions begin, the next question is unavoidable. What is actually within your control and what never was? That distinction is where real freedom starts. At this point, something important should feel different, not emotionally dramatic, not motivational, clearer. You've seen that reactions aren't random. They don't come from the world itself. They come from judgments formed quietly inside the mind. You've seen how expectation, attachment, and identification work together. And you've seen how awareness creates distance, just enough space for control to appear. This understanding alone won't make you perfect, and it doesn't need to. Stoicism was never about perfection. It was about direction. Once you see the mechanism behind reaction, you stop fighting the wrong battle. You stop trying to control people. You stop demanding that situations behave differently. You stop exhausting yourself by resisting emotions directly. Instead, your attention shifts inward, to the place where reactions actually begin. And this is where most people misunderstand Stoicism. They think it's about enduring more, tolerating more, accepting everything passively. It isn't. Stoicism is about discrimination, about knowing what deserves your energy and what never did. Because here's the quiet truth. Most of what disturbs you was never yours to manage in the first place. Other people's opinions, their moods, their timing, their understanding, their approval. Trying to control these things is what creates frustration. The Stoics believed freedom begins the moment you stop demanding control where none exists. And that belief changes everything. It changes how you respond to disrespect, how you handle delay, how you move through uncertainty. It doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. Calm isn't weakness, it's clarity without noise. And clarity is strength. This is not a mindset you switch on, it's a way of relating to life. This channel isn't about motivation, it's not about collecting quotes, and it's not about pretending life doesn't affect you. It's about building control, layer by layer, where it actually matters. If this way of thinking resonates with you, stay with it. Not because you need constant content, but because discipline grows through continuity. And the next step isn't optional. If calm is something you genuinely want, it's learning to separate what is within your control from what never was. Most people never make that distinction, and that's why they stay reactive. We won't.